We're up and running, Dove? Thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. And the topic tonight and tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh Av, the start of the month of Av. It starts what is traditionally referred to as the 9 days. And interesting, we discussed last time that there are different practices and things that we abstain from during the 9 days. Ashkenazic and Sephardic traditions are different when it comes to this. Ashkenazim are a little bit more strict, despondent, morose. I'm not sure. The Sephardim are a little happier with life, right? So as in the 9 days, we will certainly minimize any showering that we do besides preparations for Shabbos. We don't have meat and wine besides on Shabbos. And also, in terms of not doing laundry, not wearing freshly laundered garments. But I want to focus today on more of the sources and understanding of what happened and how we approach that, how it has reverberated throughout the generations, throughout time, and how all of that comes together for these 9 days, as they're called, and for Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, is our national day of mourning. That is our national day of mourning. We will discuss that. This year it falls out on Shabbat, and therefore it gets pushed off. Shabbat is a regular Shabbat, at least when it comes to any of the external parts of Shabbat. When it comes to more private things of Shabbat, when it comes to, let's say, marital relations between a married couple, so then on next Shabbat we would abstain because that's more of a private matter. But in terms of the public matters, there is no outward sign of Tisha B'Av and the fast day, and all of its restrictions are pushed off until Sunday, which is on the calendar, the 10th of Av. Just before we start, an interesting teaching that I heard, that when Shabbos is a very, very welcoming host. When Rosh Chodesh falls out on Shabbos, Shabbos is a very welcoming host. And Shabbos gives up its usual 8th Aliyah, we call the Maftir, and its usual Haftorah reading to welcome in a Rosh Chodesh with its special Maftir, 8th Aliyah, and Haftorah reading. Haftorah is the reading from the prophets that we do each week that coincides thematically with the Shabbos reading. When Yom Tov, when Chol HaMoed or Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, then Shabbos very graciously, not only does it give up its 8th Aliyah, it gives up all of its Aliyot. All of the Aliyot are given up, and certainly the Maftir and the Musaf also changes in all those cases. When Yom Kippur falls out on Shabbos, Shabbos, ever the gracious host, gives up all of its davenings. The Torah reading is Yom Kippur, and the Shemona Esreis are transformed to Shabbos and Yom Kippur, and even the meals, the Shabbos meals, Shabbos is willing to give it up for its host, for its guest. Shabbos graciously hosts its guest and gives up the meals also, and that's a time that we will fast on Shabbos. When it comes to Tisha B'Av, which is a day of sadness,
we don't give up.
Shabbos says, you know what? I'll stay where I am. I'll keep mine. And we push it away. You know, sometimes you have people. If a person is coming in with, sometimes a person is always dispelling this sadness. I think Saturday Night Live used to have Debbie Downer, right, as one of their characters, right? So when it comes to a Debbie Downer, Shabbos says, not here, not in our space, not in our place. You can bring your doom and gloom and moroseness, you can bring that elsewhere. But let's understand where the 9 days all begins from, where Tisha B'Av all began, and it begins in the Torah, in Bamidbar, the book that we are concluding this forthcoming Shabbos. The Meraglim, the spies, the scouts come back. Vayotziu diba ta'aretz asher taru ota, and they delivered the evil report of the land that they had scouted, they had spied. And when the children of Israel hear that report, vatisa kol ha'eda, and the entire congregation lifted up, vayitnu et kolam vayivku, they lifted up their voices, and they cried, balayla hahu, and they cried on that night. And Hashem said, v'mispara yimim asher tartem et ha'aretz arbim yom l'shana, tisu et avonotechem, arba'im shana. According to the number of days you spied out the land, 40 days, 1 day for each year. It'll be 40 years until the children of Israel will enter the land of Israel. And all of you who cried that cry, you will not enter the land of Israel. And all of them, all those who were 20 and older, all the men, I should say, who were 20 and older, the women were passionate about the land of Israel. But the men who cried this needless cry, who were 20 and over, they did not enter the land of Israel. And source number 2, the Babylonian Talmud, the Gemara Tanis, says, Atem bechitem bechina shel chinam, you cried a crying that was unwarranted, for naught, chinam, for free. Ani koveya lachem b'chia lidorot. I will establish for you a crying for generations. As we have written here, the night of the spies' report was Tisha B'Av. And it was on this day that both temples were destroyed and many other tragedies took place throughout Jewish history. So, sometimes we hear this and we might think, mistakenly compare this, to a parent getting frustrated with a child. Stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry about. The Ralph Cramden view on parenting, even though he didn't have any kids in the show, but that's kind of how you imagine he would have approached it before Alice would calm him down. Right? And at first glance, right, you cried for nothing, I'll give you something to cry about. But that clearly is not the understanding, that is not the way that Hashem acts. The Maharal in Netzach Yisroel writes as follows: V'zeh she'amar she'yubochem b'china shel chinam u'ma'asu be'eretz chemda. That we said they were crying an unwarranted cry, and they despised, rejected the land of Chemda. English says the land of Israel, right? But Eretz Chemda is the land, the desirous land, the land that is so precious. V'davar zeh nikva lehem b'chia lidorot. And this established, caused for them b'chia, crying for generations. Shayagorem shegalu min haaretz. That was the cause of our being exiled from the land. Ki b'chia sheyubochem moresh eina eretz shayach lehem legamrei. The Maharal always speaks about something that is an inherent connection that you have. I'm sorry?
Part of it also was that the generation that was in the wilderness was the slave generation. They had a slave mentality, a loser. Their kids grew up in freedom in the and therefore would go forward.
We will see. We will see some aspects of that. We will see. That's not the Maharal. We will see some aspects of that Ida. So the Maharal says the crying showed that the land was not shayach lahem legamre, that there was a lacking. They had not forged a complete connection to the land. So if we don't have the connection to the land, then the understandable consequence of that is a distancing from the land. And then we'll need to, as we'll soon see some other forces, some other explanations, we'll then need to establish a desire, a longing for the land. Let's see how Rav Dessler explains this in number 4. You cried without a cause. I will establish a reason to cry on this day for generations. Crying is an expression of internal pain. What is this unwarranted cry, crying without cause? It flows, he says, from a lack of faith, a lack of trust. When we stood by the border of the Holy Land, we resisted entering, saying, Lama Hashem mevi'otanu el eretz hazot linfol b'charev. Why will God bring us to this land? We will fall by the way of the sword. It was God's hate for us that He took us out of Egypt to give us over into the nation of the Amoraim, that we will be destroyed. It was a lack of faith in God's ability, in God's connection to us, in what God would do for us. And also, this actually is one of the classic ideas in psychology of projection, right? That we were feeling this sinah, this animosity, this almost hatred towards God. So what do we do? What does one do? One projects that onto the other. God hates us. And that's why He took us out here to destroy us. Upegam zeb vitachon shu chisoram b'pnimit. This lack of trusting was a deep lack in our devekut, in our connection to God. The only way that would be corrected is by establishing crying throughout the generations. And that idea is explained a little bit further in a moment. In Ner Le'elef, booklet on Bamidbar Shavuot, the crying in the future would be the desire to come closer to God. At the time, the Jewish people cried because they were too close to God and would continue to be so. It's an interesting concept. Baal Peor, which was a strange, absurd, abhorrent type of idolatry. Actually, this idol was worshipped by one performing bodily functions in front of and upon the idol, right? And it doesn't sound all of that alluring. It doesn't sound all of that too tempting. But the explanation is given that to a certain degree, the lure of Baal Peor was the 1960s, meaning anything goes. Anything goes. And it has morphed in our generation, in our time, to this relative morality. Who are you to tell me what's right or what's wrong? Right? Who are you to take your view of the world, your morals, and put that on me? So Baal Peor, basically, according to this view of it, what's happening is, if I could take God, the idol, I could take God, and I can relieve myself on it, then that means that there's nothing that I can do that you'll say, now you've gone too far. So there's nothing that anyone could raise their eyebrows and say, oh, come on, that's not right. If this is what I do to my God, then the world life is an absolute free-for-all, and I can do whatever I want, whenever I want to do it, and who are you to tell me no? Because this is what I do with God, right? We all have certain lines that we draw. It's like the Italian, but don't talk about my mother, right? That's where we draw the line, right? The mafia can be shooting people in the street, but don't say a word about their mother, right? There's certain, right? But if I'm dedicating on my God, nothing is sacred, nothing is held back. Now, for the children of Israel, who were living such a scrutinized life in the desert with God literally all over them, all around them, the clouds, the man, right? So therefore, for them, the idea of breaking out of this box was very alluring. So they were too close to God, and will continue to be so. They felt they cannot continue the land of Israel with the intense divine providence they had experienced in the desert. They'd rather go back and suffer under the Egyptians. God's response was they would get what they wanted: distance from him. But he assured them they would cry for generations, and their future cries would be because of that distance. As a result of that distance, they would see temples destroyed, and they would cry. Because of that distance, they would see their land taken over by others, and then being sent out into exile, and they would cry. That crying would be the right type of crying. It would be crying of wanting to get closer to God, not further away. And it would lead to where the original crying led away from. It would lead us to where the original crying led away from. The original crying led us away from Israel. This crying would lead us to Israel. Return to the land, and ushering in of the Messianic era. So it was in order to correct that which was lacking, we needed to correct head on. So we cried because we wanted a distance. Okay. Experience that distance and realize how painful that distance is, and therefore our cries. And you just think back over time, over the millions of Jewish tears that have been shed over the exile, over not being in Jerusalem, over not being in the land of Israel, of every tefillah, every prayer of every Jew, no matter where they are in the world, is said facing towards Israel, right? I might be in the west, my heart is there in the east, right? That is the correction that we are meant to, and the transformation that we are meant to go through. The Mishnah, we mentioned this last times, the Mishnah in Tana speaks about the 5 calamities of Tisha B'Av, focus on the destruction of the temple and Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. The Mishnah says, Chamisha Dvarim, 5 things happened to Avotenu on Tisha B'Av. Number 1, Nigzar Avotenu, the source we had above from a midbar. It was decreed, Shelo Yikansu La'aretz, who will not enter the land. V'charav Abayit B'Rishonah, the first temple was destroyed. Uba Shniyah, and the second temple was destroyed. V'nilkada Beitar, and the city of Beitar was captured. V'nechra Sha'ir, and Jerusalem, the city of Yerushalayim, was plowed over. Let's go through each of these 5. The destruction of the first temple, that is still found within Tanakh. Right? Our Tanakh, our Holy Scripture, canonized, stretches through the time, from creation, etc., and it goes straight through. After the Torah finishes, we enter into the land of Israel in the era of the Shoftim of the prophets, and then the kings, including King Solomon, who built the first temple, and and then the split of the kingdom that took place during the reign of his son Rechavam into the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Israel, and all the kings that continued there, and with the prophets, and we go up until we go through the Chorban, the destruction of the temple. We have Yirmiyahu speaking about it. We have Eicha, Lamentations, that we'll read on a week from this Saturday night. On Tisha B'Av, we read the Lamentations. And then we also have scripture still about the Babylonian exile and prophets during that time period, including the events of Purim, Megillat Esther, and then we have Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, who were there at the return to Israel after the 70-year Babylonian exile, and the start of the rebuilding of the Second Temple. And that is where our Tanakh, the books, the holy books, the canonized books, come to an end with the close of the era of prophecy. So therefore the destruction of the first temple is recorded throughout our scripture. It's found in Malachim, it's found in Yirmiyahu. However, in Malachim it's described as follows: U'b'chodesh Chamishi, in the 5th month, B'shiva l'chodesh, on the 7th day of the month. The 19th year, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Bavel, Nebuzaradan came, Nebuzaradan, the chief general, and he came to Yerushalayim, v'yisrof et Beit Hashem, vet Beit HaMelech, and he burned the house of God, and the house and the palace of the king, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and all the houses of dignity, all the great houses. Some say it refers to the shuls, some say it refers to the study halls. Saraf be'esh. He burnt it with fire. So here it says in Malachim and Kings that it took place on the 7th day. In Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, it says, again, the 5th month, be'esor lachodesh, on the 10th day of the month, which is the 19th month of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bavel. Cain was Radan, before the king of Bavel, Yerushalayim, v'saraf, and he burnt Beit Hashem, Beit HaMelech, and Beit Yerushalayim, Bat Yerushalayim, called by the Gosar of Be'esh. Right? So one set of verses say that he came, and he came on the 7th, and he burnt. And the other one says he burnt it on the 10th. The Gemara deals with this apparent contradiction in source number 9. You can't say the 7th. Yirmiyahu says the 10th. You can't say the 10th. Malachim says the 7th. How do we resolve this? On the 7th, that's where they entered into the Beit HaMikdash compound. V'achlu, and they ate there. The kilkulu, and they acted with, and they desecrated there on the 7th, and on the 8th, and on the 9th. And then, some of the chashecha, hitzitu bo et ha'or. Then, close to the nighttime of the 9th, that's where they lit the fire. Vayadolek v'holech kol hayom kulo. And it burned the entire day of the 9th and then the 10th. So the first verses says that he entered on the 7th and then he burnt on fire, not on the 7th. They desecrated 7th, 8th. On the 9th, towards the end of the day, he lit the fire and it burned through the 9th and through the 10th. To the point that Rabbi Yochanan said, had I been there in that generation, I would have established the fast day to be on the 10th of Av, since that is when most of the destruction took place. But the reason the Gemara says for the rabbis who established it on the 9th is because of the idea of atchalata to pur anuta, the start of the punishment, where it erupted, where it began. That has a certain heaviness, and therefore they established it on the 9th. But being that most of the burning took place on the 10th, on a normal year when we're fasting on the 9th, we continue to observe certain limitations until chatzot, until midday, halachic midday of the 10th of Av. This year, where the 9th of Av is on Shabbos, so we're fasting on the 10th of Av. So that Sunday is the 10th of Av. The day after is already the 11th of Av, so we don't have those restrictions on the next day, though that night we still wouldn't have. That night we still wouldn't have meat or wine, or actually someone approached me about having a wedding that night, or wedding that night. Okay, so that is number one on the list of the events that took place on the destruction of the first temple. Source number 10, destruction of the second temple. That took place in the year 70 CE. CE, I like to say, stands for?
Common error.
Common error. That's how I said it. The common error. Sorry. Okay? But I mean, just realize how close that is. Right? You know, we're talking about in our world. The destruction of the second temple in the year 70 CE came long after the end of the biblical period. So it was not described in the works of the prophets, right? I mentioned the prophets took us through the start of the second temple. The first temple stood for how many years? 410. Second temple, 420. So the time of the destruction of the second temple was long after the close of the biblical period of the prophets of our canonized books. Nevertheless, Jewish tradition has preserved for us the details of its destruction. And once again, the Gemara in Tanit tells us, Ubashniya minalan. The Gemara asks, how do we know? The Gemara's comments on the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah is like a zip file, and the Gemara opens up all the teachings of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah simply said the first temple was destroyed, and the Gemara brought those verses that we just saw, the contradictory verses, the 7th, the 10th, and the Gemara resolved it. The Gemara continues now. The next thing mentioned in the Mishnah was the second one was the second temple was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. How do we know that? The Gemara asks. Titania, the Gemara brings a braita, an explanation as follows: Megalgal in zuchut liyom zakai. Good things come about on good days, and bad things, tragedies, come about on ominous, tragic days. Amru, they said, Kishakarav Beit HaMikdash B'Rishonah, Ota Yom Erev Tisha B'Av Haya, when it was when the first temple was destroyed, that day, that evening was Tisha B'Av. It was a Motzei Shabbos Haya, Saturday night. Motzei Shvias Haya was the end of the sabbatical year. Umishmeret Shel Yehoyariv Haita. There were different shifts of Kohanim, 24 shifts of Kohanim who would come to do the service. It was the shift of Yehoyariv. Leviim were saying Shira Omdin, standing al Duchanam, standing in the place where they would stand to sing. Umash Shira Hayom, what were they singing? V'yashav aleim etonam. Hashem, bring upon them their sins. Uvara'atam, and with their own evil, cut them off. The pasuk continues, Yatzmiteim Hashem Elokeinu, cut them off, Hashem our God. For they did not, lo espiku, they did not have enough time to say the end of the pasuk, Ad shebo nachrim, until the enemies came. V'kavshum, and conquered it. V'chein b'shniya. And if we do not have a set date that is specified for the destruction of the second temple, that means only one thing. There was no need to specify the date. If the date's not specified, it means it was on that date. On that date, that tragic date for Am Yisroel, for our people, which is Tisha B'Av. Number 12, destruction of Beitar. Although not directly connected to the destruction of the second temple itself, the destruction of the city of Beitar by the Romans 65 years later marked the final blow. That was the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the period of persecution initiated by the Roman Emperor Hadrian served to deepen the exile begun with the destruction of the temple. And you think about it, right? The Jews then knew history. We had the destruction of the first temple, and then 70 years later we had the building of the second temple. And then Bar Kokhba arises, and we're in the 60th year of Galus. And the Jews are thinking Bar Kokhba, Jews, great Jews, including Rabbi Akiva, thought Bar Kokhba might be, or was, or could have been the Mashiach. Right? And they're hoping to return, right? The Mashiach, the building of the Bayit Shlishi, the end, the same way the 70 years ended the first. Now, around 70 years, we have Bar Kokhba. And when he was defeated and killed, and Beta was destroyed, that was a deepening of the exile and a tremendous, tremendous depression for the people. And that's what set in motion the long, long, long exile that we are still part of. We are blessed to have seen the awakenings of the exile with our return to Israel and establishing of the state of Israel. But we're not quite there yet. Yes, Janet?
I understand that initially low-level laborers and everyone did not go through gullahs. They stayed like farm laborers, and so that there were still Bnei Yisroel and Yehudit in the land under the Roman administration, and maybe a reasonable population. But after Beitar, even those, that's why it was a further gullahs, is because even those people were exiled.
Okay. Number 13, the temple site was plowed over. That's again in the year 135 CE. The Mishnah Berurah on the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law writes, Ubo b'yom ha'muchan l'poranut, on that day that was set aside for punishment, Charash tanas ruvas harash et ha'hechav et tzvivav. He plowed over that area of the Temple Mount, l'kayem, to fulfill Mashanemar, Tzion sadeh techarash. The prophecy of Jeremiah, Zion, like a field, will be plowed over. And we'll see Rabbi Wine will compare it to what's going on today also. Number 14, Rabbi Wine writes, after 135 CE, when the Bar Kokhba rebellion was crushed, Hadrian acted even more ruthlessly and set about on a campaign to wipe away not only the remnants of the Jewish people, but the memory that they had ever existed. In effect, he decided to solve the Jewish problem once and for all. And we have that going on today, erasing, right? The Jews are trying to Judaize Jerusalem. It's like saying that the New Yorkers are trying to New Yorkize Brooklyn, right? And the French are really trying to Frenchize Paris, right? But then you have UNICEF that is coming to, this is a Palestinian heritage site. I mean, you have so much of this eraser going on now.
Why not a Judaic heritage site as well?
Because they won't give it.
There were studies, Palestinians claim that they were Palestinians. They're not. They're actually from Crypt.
Yeah.
Serious.
Yeah, I know, 100%. I'm saying, about the ridiculous claims.
It's interesting.
They tell a joke. I forgot, which Israeli prime minister, right, says that, when Moses took off his shoes to approach the burning bush, right, they were stolen by a Palestinian. They said, that's ridiculous. There weren't any Palestinians there then. He said, exactly.
It's the UN, UNESCO, publishes an art book for every country. And the art book for Israel is Byzantine mosaics, not one Jewish mosaic.
Yeah.
And many of us have seen all the Jewish mosaics in Israel. The whole book is Byzantine mosaic. Yeah. We're dispossessed.
Bring back Nikki Haley. That's what I say.
Yes.
Nikki Haley for president.
Yes.
UN stands for
Yes.
useless nations.
Well,
He realized that the final solution to the Jewish problem lay not in killing Jews, but in destroying Judaism.
where's that?
Second paragraph over here, bold in number 14. As long as the Jews had their religion, no one would ever really be able to eradicate them entirely. Therefore, he issued decrees that outlawed Judaism on the pain of death. The decrees of Hadrian were the most fearsome in history against the Jewish people. He did not stop there. He forbade mention of the name Jerusalem and renamed the holy city Aelia Capitolina. He also forbade Jews from living there. Most notable of all, he employed an army of slaves to plow over the Temple Mount. Crying throughout the years. We've had this before. You cried, Bechia shel chinam, I will establish for you a crying for generations. Interesting approach on this. Again, the Talmud Bavli in Sanhedrin teaches, we'll go in English, fathers should not be put to death on account of the children. What does this teach us, the Gemara asks? That fathers should not be executed for sins committed by the children and vice versa? We already know that. Every man is responsible only for his own sin. Therefore, fathers should not be put to death on account of the children means that fathers should not be put to death on testimony of their sons, and similarly sons on account of their fathers. So children, close relatives, cannot testify one against another. Turn to the last page of our sources. Are children then not to be put to death? It doesn't say Poket avon avot al banim. He will visit the sins of the fathers upon the children. That the Gemara answers, that is Kisha'ochsen Masa Avotayim Biyadayhen, when the children are following in the parents' footsteps. So Rabbi Leo Kitov in the Sefer HaToda'ah explains how this fits with Tisha B'Av. You wept for no reason, number 17. I will appoint this day for you as a time of weeping throughout generations. Does God act out of vengeance or out of anger? Why should subsequent generations be held culpable for the sins of that generation? Were not the children of that generation punished, having to wait to enter the land for 40 years till their fathers passed away? And in later generations, when their descendants were exiled from the land because of their own sins, what connection is there between the sins of the fathers and the calamities that befell their descendants, which God ordained should take place in Tisha B'Av, the day in which the fathers sinned? The explanation, he writes, is as follows. As punishment for the purposeless weeping, God decreed only that in the wilderness they shall perish, referring to those who had wept, to the fathers. The children who had not sinned entered the land and inherited. Although the children had not evidenced their father's trait of ingratitude, it was part of their makeup, because a parent finds expression in their children. Even though children were not to be punished for their father's sins, God saw fit to purify the children of this inherited trait of ingratitude. Because the fathers had despised the precious land and showed this attitude with their purposeless crying, declaring, let's go back to Egypt, God ordained that there be a weeping in the subsequent generations on this date. The weeping of many generations of sons throughout the lands of their dispersion would serve to rectify the weeping without reason, which was the sin of the first generation. Even in times of prosperity and tranquility, they would remember the land and would shed tears, yearning to return and rebuild her desolate soil. And thus we see God acted charitably toward Israel in setting the date for future exiles on the very date when the generation of the wilderness had sinned. So any future exiles was because of their and our, meaning if we are in a similar state, means we are repeating that behavior, our sins. But God set that up on the very date when the generation of the wilderness had sinned. That way, the tears of subsequent generations would rectify that which the fathers had ruined with their purposeless tears. So no one's held accountable for anyone else's sins. But our sins, which led to our exile, that was made to coincide with the date of our forefathers crying. That way, the crying that we would have over the exile would serve to rectify their tears. 18, the Midrash says, From the time the temple was destroyed, the Mashiach was born. And that we find the very last Gemara in Makot, which tells of Rabbi Akiva and other sages walking along and seeing the Temple Mount, seeing the desolation, and seeing a fox running through the Temple Mount. And the other rabbis, other sages, tore their garments and started crying. Rabbi Akiva started to smile and laugh. They said, Rabbi Akiva, why are you laughing? Why are you smiling? He said to them, why are you crying? And they said, why are we crying? The place about which it was written that if a non-Kohen enters, it's so holy that a non-Kohen entering is punishable by death. And now it's destroyed, it's plowed over, and a fox is running through. How can we not cry? And he answered, that's why I am laughing. Because there is a prophecy about the destruction, and there's a prophecy about Odi Shama, Ba'arei Yehuda, where we sing at every wedding. Once again, they will be heard in the streets of Jerusalem, in the mountains of Judah. Kol sason v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala, the sound of rejoicing, the sound of grooms and brides. And until that first prophecy was fulfilled, I was waiting, when will the second one be fulfilled? Now the first prophecy has been fulfilled. We are now ready for the second prophecy. Mashiach was born. I just want to add a point that Natalie made, which I think is a very, very powerful thought. Holocaust denial. So that's something that hurts and roils us to the core. Right? We know, right? We had an Izzy here in the shul. We had a Mr. Gelman here in the shul. We have a Mr. Marcel Nutel here in the shul. We have people who have survived. Right? Family members that we know have been wiped out. I grew up, and I was unique amongst my friends, that I grew up knowing 4 grandparents. Most of them knew 0 grandparents. Most of my friends knew none of their grandparents. So it shakes us to the core, this Holocaust denial. But realize that if the 9 days, if Tisha B'Av are like any other days to us, then we too are acting as deniers of Jewish history, of deniers of who we are, of where we came from, of our rich heritage, and the destruction and the subsequent rebuilding. We too, if we don't join in with the sense of the 9 days of Tisha B'Av, then we too are joining hands with that scourge of our day that is so, so painful. And as the Gemara says, those who mourn the loss of Jerusalem, may we all merit to speedily, as the Gemara says, witness and enjoy and celebrate the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Yeah.
It's easy to be contemplative, as you say, and think about these things and say it would be better to have a more elevated spiritual connection. I find here with the good weather and everything to be also grateful for, and the green in Irvine, and it's very difficult to actually be sad.
Okay.
And is that, how bad is that? If you realize...
We're supposed to work on feeling it, and that's why, because a person is acted upon by their actions, that's why we have the different things that we minimize during these days, to help us feel that and sense that.
And that's not being so ungrateful for, to live in Irvine and...
It's not being ungrateful at all. We could look, a person loses someone, even if you live in Irvine, you feel the loss.
Yes, this is true.
Right? No one says, hey, it's beautiful, so I'm not going to sit Shiva. Right?
Is it this Shabbos?
No, Tisha B'Av is a week from this Sunday.
Okay. Next Shabbos.
It comes out next Shabbos, but we don't.
Sunday.